And okay, and so if you remember, last week we were talking about the progressive web apps, and the main goal of the progressive web apps is to make your normal web app behave much more like a native app on the phones. So for example, you should be able to add icons to your home screen, and they will start full screen, and it can also work offline, even when there's no internet connection. Obviously, and it will not fully function, for example, if certain things need to, say, save data to the server. And also in terms of the PWA, and you actually does not need to make too much changes to your existing code. And in terms, for example, the interface and the logic in the sense how the app works, and those part does not have to change at all. You need to add a web manifest file, some settings, and similar to package.json, and you need to add a service worker. Okay, and so that's pretty much everything in terms of the PWA. And then this week, we're going to start to move on the Vue components. So this is kind of good software engineering practice. So as your code or as your app becomes larger and more complex, has more functions, and you have more code. And obviously, you don't want to put all the code in one file. And for now, your kind of main file, if you remember from, for example, and the front end of your Vue app maybe has more than 100 lines of code now, if you did not break it already, or even more. And then this file is starting to get long and made difficult to find errors and improve the code. And then another main reason of having component is, say, for something you want to reuse multiple times and you want to make it into a component, then you don't have to write the same code again and again every time you need it. So that's our two main things, or the main reasons we have component. One is to, say, break down the code, make it more manageable, and the other one is to be able to reuse certain code. I mean, in terms of reuse, almost like a function. So if certain block of code appears multiple times, and you might want to turn that into a function, then you every time want to reuse it, just need to call it with one line of code instead of repeating the entire block. Okay. Yeah, and so again, so kind of repeat it, and we kind of mentioned this already. And your front-end file, which was done in Vue, is probably getting larger and make it difficult to debug and change. And if you can split it into multiple smaller files, will make it much more manageable. Yeah, and so the other reason is we want to make the code reusable. And if it's something repeat a few times, and you can either make it into function, but sometimes it's more like a component of the app, for example, a card or a button, or just a block of information. And it's better to make that into component. Okay, so the components, as we said, and one of the goals to reduce and simplify the code. And then we can put the repeated parts of the code and separate into one separate file. And this is also allow us, as I said, to reuse the same component throughout the application. And sometimes if it's well designed, and you can even reuse components from other applications. Okay, and so in production, when people actually using Vue to develop a commercial product, and most of them will have one or more components, and because the actual commercial product is usually much larger or more complex than the examples were shown in the module. And they usually have these very kind of natural parts, separate parts of the app. For example, that's the part of the login, that's the part for search, and that part for the shopping cart. and these can naturally has a separate and relatively independent functions, which makes them a natural choice to make them into a component. And okay, so this, and as a component, and it can contain any number of code, and usually these are actually just HTML code. And you can give any name to the component so long as you follow the naming convention. There's certain restrictions. For example, you're not allowed to use special characters in the name. And hyphen is preferred. I think you're not allowed to use capital letters because the name does not differentiate between. Essentially, this will be treated as an HTML element, and it does not recognize or differentiate between capital letters and lowercase letters. Okay, and say this is a block of code that's going to use reused many times and in our app, and so we can turn that into a component. And so it contains a div, and inside div is an unordered list, and then you have a item which just shows a component example. Okay, and so obviously the actual component can be much more complex. And this is just as the example. Okay, so first, before you can use the component, you need to define. And once you define it, you can just add this line of code wherever you need in your Vue app. Obviously, first it has to be inside the Vue app, and because otherwise the browser itself would not understand my component, what it looks like. And you can see the way it works, and it's almost like an HTML element. So you have a starting tag and a closing tag, except that you don't have anything in between. You could put something in between, but for now, say if you put some text inside in between, and it won't do anything, it just be ignored. And because Vue would not know how to use the information in between the starting and ending tags. Or let's say this is the template for the component or the code for the component, and it does not use any information that you put in between the starting and ending tags. Okay, and because you are not putting anything in between the starting and ending tags, and you can also just do this, and just to further reduce the amount of code, also make it a bit cleaner. And so this is like the one tag, including both the starting and the ending tag. So it has this slash just before the ending bracket. I think that example like this is like the image tag from HTML, and you have the image, you have some properties, and usually you don't have a separate ending image tag, you just have a slash. That means that it represents both the starting and the ending tag. Okay. And yeah, and so this is another benefit of using components. So if you make changes to the component, and then old instance will be updated. Let's say this is your component, and you use it 5 times in your code. Now you want to change the text, and for the list item, let's say it's called component example 2, and then previously, if you don't use component, you have to manually change the 5 appearance of this code. Now, if you just change here, and then old instance, wherever you use this particular component, and the text in there will change. Obviously, you can add more things, add other list items, change color, etc., and they do affect all the components. Okay, so as I said, and before we can use, you have to first define or creating a component. Okay, and now we're gonna first create a Vue root instance. And this instance is special or called the root because it can have other instances inside it. Okay, and then also that's required to register a component. And the next part, and more importantly, is to register a component or create a component either locally or globally. and which I'll explain what those means. And so global components can be used throughout the application. So that means once it's defined and you can use it anywhere, and you might have multiple instances. As we said, you can have a root and it has also child instances, and you can use it all in all the instances within the same app. Whereas the local components, and it can only be used in the Vue instance that's created it. And so you create the instance or registered instance within a particular Vue instance, sorry, the component in a Vue instance. And that's the only place you can use it. And in the other instance, you couldn't. And so in terms of the instance, and so if you remember, and when we write the code, you would, at the beginning, the first line of JavaScript would say, maybe say, constant Vue app equal to new Vue, and then bracket with all the Vue code. That's an instance. And so the local components you can only use in the instance that's registered it or created it. Okay, and we'll start by example, you creating a global component and just call it my component. As I said, the name you can choose, decide. Doesn't really matter, just has to make sure you follow the conventions. Okay, and so it's a good practice to name a component with lower cases. And so that's as we said, you can see in the example before, when you use it, it's almost just like the way you would use an HTML element. And the HTML element does not differentiate between upper and lower cases. So it's a good practice here and to make it lower cases. Again, it's recommended to use hyphens to connect multiple words. And again, just because it does not differentiate between upper and lower cases. And so you can't use camel case. You can't say my and hyphen capital C and component, because that's not recognized. So that's why, and the hyphen is recommended. Okay, and to create a global component, and it must be placed before the Vue instance. And so this is our Vue instance. Oh, just waiting to, okay. Just here, yeah. And so you've done this many times already, starting from the first coursework, and you have a new Vue instance, which is an instance of the Vue class, and you put in EL data, and then say methods and say computed property, etc., etc. That's the instance. And so this is a part that you're creating the component. And this is defined before the instance. And also this will become a global component. And that needs to be before the Vue code, because if you want to reference my component in your Vue instance, it will not be recognized if it's not already defined here. Okay, and you can see, so in the component definition, yeah, so here we'll just define right before. In this component, so they say Vue, so that's the Vue class, which will be available just from when you imported the Vue library. And so this way is creating a new instance of Vue, and this is calling a function directly, or method of Vue directly. So that's the component, method or function. So this is the name of the component. So this is the part that you can change, and then followed by a JSON object. You can see this and curly bracket. You should be familiar by now. And these are JSON object, and it will have a few properties and or say the keys and values. And the first one is called the template, and later on the other ones, and where you can include things, say JavaScript code, which are called script. But the template is the HTML template. Essentially, this will be the HTML code. So in this case, the template including a div with some fixed text. And so it's not particularly exciting, but that's kind of one of the simple ones we can start with. Okay, so that's a as we said, and so this is essentially an HTML code, but you have to put it inside the code. And because for JavaScript or for the JSON object, and this is a key, and this is a value for that particular key, and the type of this value is a string. So that's why you have to put it inside the code. And at this stage, or from a JavaScript point of view, it doesn't understand. And this part is HTML code. That's something only the Vue library understands. Okay. So this is also very important. And I can't remember if we mentioned this before. But in the template, and sometimes you have more than one line of HTML code. And for example, you might have a H1, a P, paragraph, and some maybe unordered list, etc., etc. But you must have kind of one root element that's including everything. Okay, and so otherwise you're gonna get an error in the template code. Okay, I'll demonstrate that later, but for now I'll just describe. For example, you have a div, and after div you can have, say, a P followed by an H1 by another UL something, and then in that case you don't have one element including all the HTML template, and in that case, and if the viewer are going to give you the error, and we'll see that in a second. So in this case, you have the div, which includes everything, and you can have inside the div, you can have, say, and besides the text, you can have new H1 paragraph or unloaded list, etc. But you cannot have another element right after this div, and because in that case, you don't have one single element which including everything inside the template. That's just a requirement from Vue. It's still valid HTML, but just Vue, it will not work in that case. Okay, and so once you define it, then you can use it in your Vue app, and just similar to an HTML element. So we already saw this before. And so in terms of script, and we're already seen this before. So this is where you define a component, which is called my component. And it only has one line of HTML code, which is one line of text. And then you create this Vue instance that links to a particular element, which is ID is app. So which is this one. Now inside this div, I'm using the component I just defined. The way of using it is similar to HTML elements. So the name has to be the same. So I have to code my element, and this is the starting tag, and this is the ending tag. And you don't put anything in between. You could just use one tag as well. Okay, I'm gonna just stop there and do a quick demo. Let me find the code. Yeah. Give me a second. Okay, and so hopefully you can see that. Yeah. And so I'm gonna create a new file for the component global. Okay, and this is still an HTML file. added some component example. And so, okay, so in the body, we define the HTML element which is the mounting point for the view app. So we're gonna just call it app, divide the app. Okay. And then after that, we're gonna do some script. This is where we defined, or we're going to define the view instance. So you can see we're gonna use first define the component itself. So we're going to do view.component and the name. Okay. And then inside here, we're going to create a JSON object on here, which is going to be including the actual code for my component. So the first one is the template. So that's the HTML code part of your component. As we said, it has to be a string, so it has to be inside the code, and we're gonna just do. So here, the how do I say, the Visual Studio Code the code completion part would not work because it doesn't understand what we are typing here is a HTML code. It just think we are typing some string, so it's not going to work here. So you have to type everything yourself. Let's say this is a global view component. Okay. And so this way, and we define the now we define the view instance. Okay. And we define the mounting point, which is the element with ID called app. So that will be this one. Okay, once we've done this, we can actually use it here. So I can say, my component. Okay, so hopefully this should work. And so this is the shorthand then compared to say slash my component. Yeah, and so that's all the code we need. So and obviously what we need as well is to actually load the view library, otherwise it will not work. And so to do that, we need to use the script again. And okay. And you can see, so this is the code we used to use. And there's other links you can use as well. But I think maybe last week or very recently stopped working. And the reason actually being I find out is say because now the default view and is version 3, and so the view 2 code will not work. And so if you still want to use version 2 of the view, and you need to use this part and add 2 says that's loading the version 2.
Is it better than doing number 3, not number 2? A version 2 or version 3?
Can you say it again?
Version 2 or version 3 review.
Version 2 and version 3 and
in the
What?
view color, yeah. The package.
I'm not sure. What is the question? You mean difference between the two versions or something?
Yes. Yeah. The different the two versions.
Okay, so I guess you can look up and the difference, and there's not that much in terms of fundamental things. For example, in terms of defining view apps and, for example, all these view directives, and those parts, as there's a little change between the 2 and 3. There's the changes are mostly in the more advanced functions we didn't cover here. But make sure we can see view 2 versus. There's plenty information online tells you what are the differences. Okay, for example, you can see these things, and it's a little bit different. Yeah, exactly the way to write the code. So they are not exactly compatible. For example, here talk about mixings, and we actually didn't use it or cover it in this module. And about multiple routes, again, this is something more advanced we didn't really cover in the module. Okay, back to the code. Excuse me. So, yeah, so this should work now. Doesn't work. I'm not sure why. Opening server. Huh? I try to run service worker. Why is that? Is that because the service worker I registered? Console. Application. I did not. Okay. Localhost 3000. Okay. Demo. The file was called component. Okay. It says errors. WebSocket. Why are you using WebSocket? Okay, I mean, at least now it's starting showing what this app should be showing, oops, which is just using this one, use my component, and I can kind of repeat this a few times. And it's not refreshing. Huh? Okay, I'm gonna just run the files locally.
Is it because you got the same columns?
And each one of them should be. What are the errors? Okay, doesn't like it. Let's try. Thinking, is that because of this or? Use live preview. Localhost. Okay, so now at least the 2 works. That's 4, that'll work. And this should work. And then okay. So it seems if you use this shorthand, it doesn't work. Whereas you use this full, it will repeat. Okay, that's interesting to know. And okay, and the other things I want to mention is when we talked about here says, and you must have like a kind of like one root element, including everything inside. And for example, and in this case, if I make it a little bit easier to see, so this is first part, and then after that, it doesn't like enter. Okay, and you can see this is still valid HTML, and it essentially has these 2 elements and div, and then h1. They are not inside the same like a root element, and it's still valid. But if you run view, it would complain. So if I refresh here, is, let me see, not this one. Okay, so you can see you getting this error compiling the template. So component should contain exactly 1 root element, etc., etc. So that's exact. We don't have one. And so the way to fix it is you have to put it inside. So let's say we cut this part out, and I said this is a heading. I put a paragraph afterwards, and then I put the div around both. Okay, so you can see now, I have a div, which is like the root element starting here and ending here. And inside this div, I had a h1 and MP. And you can have more elements, as many as you like. But the important thing is everything has to be inside this div. Okay. I can refresh again. Yeah, I still got this. Maybe got something to do with these. Nope, I'm still having this socket issue. But anyway, now you can see it's working. And every time when I call this, my components, and you have the heading and a paragraph afterwards, that's what's inside. These things must be inside the div element. Okay, back to the slides now. Yeah, so that's the app here. Let me just quickly check in terms of timing. Okay, we are about halfway through. So as we said, that was a global component in the sense, you define the the components here, and you can use that in this instance, and maybe later on in your body you have div id app2, and you have another instance called the view app2 equal to new view the element mounting point is my app2, and then inside app2, and you can still use my component, and you can have h1. And we can say my okay, and just to make it easier to see, okay, and 2. And they're going to delete these ones. Okay, and you can see now I created the 2 view instance, view app and view app2. They are mounted to, the first one is here, the second one is here, and they can both use this my component inside them. So if we go back to the page, I'm going to have a refresh now. You can see, and this is the line, and from the first view app, which is this line here, and it says this is the first view instance, it used a component, and then later on the second component or second view instance would have shown this line of code, and then here is the part, and that actually it uses. So that's a global instance, so you define once and you can use it in all the view instances. If you only have one instance, and then that does not make too much differences. Okay, and back to the slides. And the next one, we said there are 2 types. The one is global, the second type is local. And so the local one is only accessible from the view instance it's registered in. Okay, and this is how you create a local component, and you just say constant component equal to blah blah blah. Okay, and here this is just really a JSON object, and it has a template, and you have the code in there, and you don't have to do this. But let's say you defined a JSON object which is called a component. Then in your view instance, you can actually register or create a component. Its name is called my component. And here, the definition of the component will be called component, which means will be this part. Okay, so in theory, you could just put this part of code here. That's completely fine. It just says if you define this outside, make it maybe slightly clearer to see. Okay, and then this is the other part, and it becomes a bit tricky. When you define the name here, you have to use this so-called camel case. And when actually using the names, you're using the component in the template, I would actually say my hyphen component. Yeah. That's the tricky part. We're a bit confusing part, and we'll see. Okay, and so here, and this components property of the view is something new. Just like it said, AL data or methods. So this is a keyword for the component. And then again, this is just say inside a big JSON object, and that's the key, and this will be the value. And the value itself is another JSON component, I say JSON object with keys and the values. Yeah. So the key is the name of the component and the value is the definition. Okay, and so this is how you would define a local component, which is defined within or registered within the instance. You can say that actually part of the code is already defined outside the instance, but here this is actually not view, it's not registering any component, and all it does is define a JSON object called component. So that's just plain JavaScript. Okay, and we can also do that. So we can add this one here. Okay, and so for example, we can define a, let's call it local. And it's a JSON object, and there's a key called template, and the value. Okay, so not particularly exciting. So this one has only a component has one line of code. Okay, and then to use that, you need to first register here. So you have to type components. Yeah, and this is called, let's call it my local. What if I just call it local component? Okay. And its definition will be local component. So this local component is this one here, which gives this part. And then after that, I can use it in my app. And so it would only work within this div, which this app is the mounting point for this part, which is that where it's defined. So I can do local component. Okay, and I can't use it here. So if I type local, and in this app too, which is this view, because it's not defined there, so it should not recognize and it will not display this thing. It might give you an error. Okay, and we can switch back to here. And let's see. Let's do a fresh. Okay, and we can see now in this first view instance, we have this part, global component, and then we show the local component. Yeah? And this is the second view instance. It has the global component, but it didn't show, even we put the code in here, local component, it does not show up here because that's only recognized in the first view instance. And yeah, so you can see, and there's some error there or warning there saying unknown custom elements, local components. So this is for this part. When it's complaining, this part is fine. This part, it doesn't recognize this one. So you would have an error. Okay, and so that's the difference between the local and global component. The other thing I can show you is just to say here, you don't have to do this, and you can just actually put this line of code directly inside here. That's also fine. Okay, and it's just slightly messier. So what you will see is I'm going to comment out this part. And here, instead of calling it local component, so you have to put actual definition here so that itself becomes a JSON object. And then I put in the code here. Oops. Okay. I didn't copy that. So you can see I put it in there. And say the definition of a particular component. It says template, and this is the local component. Yeah, maybe I'll change a little bit. I would say this is the local component defined in the view. Yeah. Okay, let me just view instance 2. Instance 1. Okay, and then we can go back here on the refresh. Okay, and you can see this still works exactly the same as before. And the text is slightly changed because I modified the text here. It says this is a local component defined in the view instance. Yeah, so you don't have to define the component or put the definition in your view directly in the JSON object outside the view instance. You can put it in. Sometimes, and this might be slightly more difficult to read compared to, say, just call it. Definition is local component, but it's completely up to you. Okay, I see a question in the chat. It says, is there any reasons why I would need multiple instances of view? I guess for what we're talking about, for example, we are building an online store, and there's no particular reasons. But for example, you can potentially, in theory, and on the page, you have multiple apps running. And let's say this is a page with a list of, say, different games people can play just in the browser on the web page. And each game itself can be a separate view app. And then if you define a global component, you'll be able to share the components among these different games. Might be a reason. Okay, back to the slide. Okay, so now things getting a little bit more complicated, and you can have components inside another, and this creates a parent-child relationship, and it's very much similar to HTML elements. And you can have a div, and then inside you have a h1 and then p. So then this div becomes the parent of these two other components. So it's similar here. I mean, you can almost, in many ways, the components behave almost like an HTML element. So you can have these parents and including child components. Yeah, and so as you probably already guessed, and this is the parent one because it's including the other two. And these component 2 and 3 are called child components. Okay, and so this way, then you can essentially allows you to create more complex structure. So ideally, you break down into your app into like a hierarchy or tree of these components. Okay, and here we're not gonna just do some any more complex componenting, but more importantly is about passing data between the parent and child. Okay. So a kind of a very important principle and in view, and potentially this should work in many other similar hierarchies, even say for classes. And says a child component should never access its parents' data directly. Okay, and so later on, as we will see, for each of these components, and it can have a section to save data. Okay, and then a child should never access its parents' data directly. Excuse me. And instead, you should always pass the data from parent to a child, but not the other way around. So if there's some data that needs to be shared with child, and it should be passed from parent to child. Okay, and so maybe actually, this actually meant two things. And so the first, and it's better to store the data in the parent component instead of in the child. And it's possible to pass data back from child to parent, and that's more difficult. So usually it's better to store the data in the parent, and then it can be passed to child. But this kind of the passing of data is one way. So it's only from parent to the child, not the other way around. Okay, and then in view, and this is called, this particular way to passing data is called props, which is short for properties, and which we will see later on. It actually just looks like the properties of an HTML element for the child component. Okay, and then child component must explicitly state what props it will expect in the props option, and we're going to see some examples later on. And so when you define the child component, and it should have a property called props, and then with a list of the properties or props expect. In this case, it's only expecting one, but nonetheless you have an array because you can have more than one. So here, and the comment is a property that will be passed on from the parent to the child, or the child is expecting this property and from the parent. Otherwise, it probably not going to working properly because you're going to use this and comment in the code later on. Okay, and previously we talked about V model, and which is a two-way binding, and the way we use it is in, say, in a text field, and we bind that to a data property in the view, and then either the text field changes or the data property changes, the other linked or binded property would change. So that's two-way binding. And so the props is one-way binding. So the parents, when they update the properties, and the child component will get the update. Let's say the parent has a list of the products, and they changed, say, the availability of the number of space or availability inventory number for a particular product, and then the child would get the updated list automatically. There's nothing you need to write code for, but not the other way around. And in theory, you could actually. So in the child component, you can actually also change the inventory number of a particular product, but you are not supposed to do that. Okay. See, it's not possible to enforce these rules to prevent child from accidentally mutating the parent's state. And that's just basically because if you passing something by reference, for example, if you from the parent, you pass to the child a JSON object, and by the definition, it's passing by reference. So it's still referencing to the original JSON object, or in this case, or an array. And then the child can still change this object and array inside its child component. And there's nothing can stop that, because that's just how JavaScript works. When you pass a reference to an object and array, whoever got the reference can change the original and object. Okay, so this is something you have to pay attention in your code to make sure you don't do that. Okay. Okay, and so literal props are just static text, and you can pass to a component, and that's not particularly exciting. But nonetheless, still useful to know. And so you can see here. Okay, maybe let's look at this part first. And this is an example which is defining a local component. And then the way to define it, as similar as before, it defined a JSON object, which actually containing all the things for the component definition. Whereas later on you register the component, you just call or just reuse this JSON object you defined before. And then in the definition, you had a template, which is the same as before. Essentially, it's a text inside, and it's just the HTML template. But you can see, and it's actually using the curly bracket here. So this text is the props defined here. So that's something new. That means I'm expecting properties or props passed from my parent, and that property will be called a text. And then I can use the value of that in my HTML template. So here we'll replace this with whatever the value of the text is passed from parent. Okay. And so when you're actually using this component, you can see to specify the value of text, there's a text here, is the text here. So these two have to match, and this will be the values. In this case, and the value itself is just a fixed string. So that's why it's here. It's called literal props, just test string. And then this value will be put here, if that makes sense, and then displayed. So when this line of text or template is run, it actually would display hello world. So the hello comes from here, the world comes from this. And as I said before, the way this works is almost like a property. The text is almost like a property of an HTML element, which is like component. And this values is whatever value you want to put to it. So that's why, I think that's why it's called props. Okay, and we're going to do that, demo that quickly in the code. So let's say we edit this a little bit. So we get a second component. This one is local. So inside I have a template. Maybe I need to put that in front. So I'm going to do a props first. Yeah. Props itself, I'm gonna just call it text. Okay, so you can see now here, I'm using that props, whatever that is. And then when we using this component, is here, we have to say text equal to something. So this text has to be matching the name that we define here. You can define other names, but they have to match. Serialize here, and this is what you use. Gonna use some terrible text. Okay, and so when I run this, basically I can load or display this local component, and it should show this is a local component defined in the view instance with a prop. And here would show the text value would be prop text. Okay, and if I go to my code and I run, yeah, and you can see here, which is this one, and is replaced with the prop text, and which is where the which is what we put in here. Yeah, and obviously this is slightly boring. If it's only fix the text, you can always just put that in template itself. But this is for now just to explain the concept. Okay, and here it's getting slightly more interesting, is about dynamic props. Okay, so dynamic will be something that can potentially change. Okay, and you can use vbind to bind a data properties to a prop, sorry, a component props. And so here, so this data property will be a data property of the parent component. And you bind that to the properties or the props of the child when it's defined. Okay, and we're gonna this probably make more sense when we see example. And you can, we said we use vbind, so we've done this many times before. If we want to change the properties of HTML elements, and we always use vbind, and then we say the value, sorry, the properties we want to change and the value. Okay, and here we just say vbind for the text. We want to bind that to message. Okay, and so the message should be in the view data function. Okay, and we've seen data before, and the function part itself is a bit new. We didn't really cover before. Okay, and so far we always define data as a key, of the view, or the value itself is a JSON object. Okay, but for components, the data has to be a function. Okay, so for root instance or root component, this is fine. You can say data and then followed by JSON object, which with a list of different and data variables you want to, or properties you want to define. But for components, data has to be a function. Yeah, so this is again some weird things about Vue, and to make it to work, basically comply with normal JavaScript syntax. And because for Vue to run in the browser, it has to be converted into normal JavaScript anyway. So its code have to meet the syntax requirement of normal JavaScript. I'm not going to go into details. So what it becomes, it will look something like here now. And so your data now becomes a function, and it will return. There's no other code in the function except for it will return the list of the properties and their values. So this is exactly the same as before here. And the only difference is now data is a function because it got brackets in it. And so you don't have comma because it's a function, and this is part of the code for the function, but there's no actual code except for a return all these data properties. Okay, and so from now on, we're going to mostly use this part because that would work in the root instance as well, and it will, so it will always work, either it's component or not. So we're going to always use this now. Yeah, so we'll take a little bit to get used to. Okay, and so let's have a look at this code and slightly more complex about the dynamic props. Okay, and so first let's look at here, which is definition of a component. Again, it's defined outside the view, which is optional, and it has the template, which is the HTML code we've seen before. It defines the props as the value you're going to get from the parent. It's completely fine, and it has data. And here it only has one called, okay, here you can see now the data is defined as a function. So it's no longer a property anymore. It's not data column, it's a function. And the inside, you return all the data properties. In this case, there's only one called tester1, and its value is a string. Not exciting, but just for demonstration purpose. Okay, and now we also define the view instance. We have the mounting points. We define the components it has. In this case, we have my components, and its definition is my components, which is this thing here. That's the component. Again, here the data we define as a function now, no longer a key value pair. Again, so it only has this one data property, which is called the message. It says from parent component. Yeah. So the main difference will be here. Okay. So when we're using the component, we are giving the values to the text prop. As we said, we're going to using vbind. So this is the shorthand with vbind. So we basically don't write vbind. We only have a column, but that is a vbind. And here we say it's message. Okay. So the message itself is a data property defined in the view instance, which is this one message here. So you should have this thing. So this message itself is dynamic in the sense it's a data property in the view instance, and the view can change the value of this message, and then it will change display. And if we look at the code here, it's slightly complicated. It will say, you're going to do hello text. This text is the prop, and it's going to get from the parent or whoever calls this component, and then the value will be the message, which is here. So it will say hello from, this will be replaced as from parent component. And then this one, this tester1 is defined inside itself. So this is not from anyone else, it's just from in this own component. And this part will be replaced with this one. Yeah. And so you're going to have two kind of variables in the data variables or data properties in the template. One comes from the prop, the other one just comes from itself. This part we've seen many times. We've seen you can define some properties and using this template. The complication here is the props is getting value from a parent data property. That's what this part does. Okay, hope that makes sense. Okay, let's give this a try. This can be a bit confusing now. So first we have to change the definition. Okay, so here in the definition, we will have one more thing, which is called the data. In this case now it's a function, and it only returns some text. I'm gonna just call it component text, maybe just, yeah. Okay. And then in the actual view instance, it's gonna have its own data function. Sorry. And inside the function, I'm gonna just return. Okay. In this case, we're gonna again, I'm gonna call this instance text, and its value would be instance text. Okay. And the template, okay. So when we actually display, we're gonna say this is a prop, maybe. So we know, okay, and for the text, which is this text here, it will display the whatever can get passed from the prop itself. That's called component. Can actually use it. We'll see. Yeah, and hope that makes sense. And so you can see in the template, or the text is going to display, and it will first display some text that comes from the prop, and later we're going to bind that to the the instance text property, and also display the component text, which is come from the component itself. So, and then finally, when we call here, we're going to bind. So we're not just text, and to, I think it's called instance text. Okay, let's see if it works. Might not, and just in terms of a hyphen. See. Okay, let's come back here. Refresh the page. Yeah. Okay, so all the change should be here. That's the local. So it says this comes from the prop. It says instance text. So instance text is what defined here, instance text. So this is what I get from the props. And then this comes from this component. It says component text. So that's the inside the component, you define the data, and its value is called the component text, and that's got the values here. Okay, and so this is common. So this is a bit different in the sense, and we bind the prop prop here. We bind the prop to a view data variable property, whatever you call it. And that values can change. And so I might even I can change it here, I believe. I can say view app, is that called view app dot compose text? No. View app dot. Okay, it's not recognized. Instance text. Okay, I can even change this one to new text. And then this bit should change, hopefully. You can see this part change. So basically that part becomes now dynamic. Or in other ways, so this is where, and the data is being passed from the parent, in this case, the root instance, and to the components using the prop and dynamically. Let me see, and I think we are a little bit behind on the time. Yeah, so I'm going to skip this part, which explaining you're not meant to change the parent properties in the child component. So what we say is you really shouldn't change message inside your component. And in this case, it's not possible because message itself is just a string and it will pass a copy. But if message is an object, it's possible to change it inside here. You can say text dot, I don't know, ID or infantry equal to 20 or something. It will change the value. That's something you're not supposed to do. And so this is the example to explain that. And it's a completely different example because we are running a bit behind out of time. So I'm going to skip this example. You can have a look. Okay, and then in terms of props, and you can actually add other things, and for validation, you can check the values being passed. So you can check the types, and you can make if specify even default values, and whether it's must use it. Maybe some of the props can be optional. And so this is example. And so here, it's a bit more complicated in a sense, and the number itself has kind of this JSON object followed by it. It specifies the type, whether it's required, and then default value. So default value means if it's not passed anything, and that's what we want the value to use. So, and if we do it here, you can see in the components, you still have the props. And then here, you just don't just list a thing. So this one becomes a JSON object. And then for each variable, sorry, each prop, it has its own set of values. And here, including say type equal to string, I think. Etc. Yeah, and so the way to write it is slightly different. So it's an object, and for each props you set a list of properties, and so on and so forth. Okay, in this case, and it defines two. One is number, the other one is string. Defines the type and what is required, and the other one defines default value. Okay, and then you can see when you're actually using the component, and for the false prompt, you bind that to my number, which is defined here, which is 43. And for the string, which is this one, it binds to pass the string, which is this one here. Its value will be hello from parent, so it should pass. Okay. And you're gonna still get an error, and because here, this 43 will be passed. Okay, and if you do something like this, this will be passed as a string and then not as a number, then it will cause an error. Okay, and so that's about parsing data, which is using props. And the next one is called custom events. And so usually the parsing the data of the props is usually happens when you first load the data, load the components. It only happens once. And here we have this component called the local component. And when that's added to the template, and it will get passed some data in the props, and that's it. And you can't really change this anymore. And later on, you might potentially change the value of instance text, and then the props will change the value, but that's about it. And the other event is, for example, if a user did something, for example, if this is a button, and when the user click the button, you want something to happen, and that's not something can be done with props. So that's where the events comes in. Okay, and to trigger or to kind of send out or create an event, you use emit and followed by the event name. And so $emit is a fixed part. You have to do it this way. And the particularly event name, you can call whatever name you want. So basically there's a text string you can define to any so long as follow the minimum requirements. And there's a one that's going to be react to the event. It's use $on and followed by the event name. So this event name and this has to match, even though you can define the actual name yourself, so long as they match. An example could be, say, an event emit, say mouse click, and it's here on mouse click, you would do something. Yeah, so this is kind of event handling, very similar to what you do in JavaScript. You do have, say, on click or on key down or key up or something. These are predefined events. Here you can customize, has your own names for the events. That's why it's called custom events. So on event is used to sending between components. They are not necessarily parent and child. And for parent and child, there are different ways to do this. And you use bOn. Okay, let me see. Yeah. So this is actually how do you parsing or handling the messages or events between parent and child. So in the child or the components, you will say this dot emit, and this will be the name of the event. So this particular method is happened when the button is clicked. When the button is clicked, it will run. So basically, the component is a button. When it's clicked, it will run this function, and this function would emit an event called increment me. Yeah. And then, okay, then in the actual code, when you using the template, when you're using this my component, which is defined here, my component, or its name is called my component here. Yeah, it will say v on increment me. Okay, the increment me is here, so it has to match. Even the name you can customize. So the v on is similar. So previously we used the v on click, where click is predefined events. Here the event is defined by yourself. It will do increment counter. So this increment counter will be the method defined in the view instance. So basically, when the child sent an event or created the event, then the parent would respond. And exactly what they do is you can define. Okay. And yeah. So here is a kind of a more complete example. What it does is say, and you have a button, the child component is button, and then when the user clicks the button, the child component will emit an event, and then which would trigger the parent component to increase the number by 1. That's all it does. Okay, and we're running out of time to go through this, but just have a look and then type it in the code. Sorry, and you can type it in and the code should just work. Okay, and that's it for now.
Are you gonna cover this the next time around? The counter?
No, I don't think we have time for that to cover in the lecture. We have to move on, and you need to just have a look at the examples. Next week, I mean, we still have other examples of this, say, in terms of events and how to handle events from the child in the parent component. We will have other examples. We can talk a bit more there. Where's my, yeah, okay.